Miller licked his chops and sat down again. Then he smiled in a good-natured manner, launched into a funny story about one friend of his, an opera singer who once in the part of Lohengrin, being tight, failed to board the Swan in time and waited hopefully for the next one. Margot bit her lips and suddenly bent forward and went off into the most girlish bits of laughter. Frau Lewandowski laughed too, her large bosom quivering softly. Good, thought Miller. If the old dog wants me to play the lovesick fool, I shall, with a vengeance. I'll do it far more thoroughly and successfully than she supposes. So he came the next day, and then again and again. Frau Lewandowski, who had received only a small advance payment and wanted the whole sum, did not leave the pair alone for a moment, but sometimes when Margot took the dog for a walk late in the evening, Miller would suddenly emerge from the darkness and stroll along by her side. It flurried her so that she involuntarily hurried her steps, neglecting the dog, which followed with his body at a slight angle to the line its wobbly trot. Frau Lewandowski got wind of these secret meetings, and henceforth took out the dachshund herself. More than a week passed in this manner. Then Miller resolved to act. It would have been absurd to pay the huge price demanded, since he was on the point of getting what he wanted without the woman's help. One night he told her and Margot 3 more funny stories, the funniest they had yet heard, drank 3 cups of coffee, and then, walking up to Frau Lewandowski, gathered her up in his arms, rushed her into the lavatory, nimbly drew out the key, and locked the door from the outside. The poor woman was so utterly taken aback at first that for 5 seconds at least she did not utter a sound, but then, "Oh, God, pack up your things quick and come along," said he, turning to Margot, who was standing in the middle of the room with both hands pressed to her head. He took her to a little flat which he had rented for her the day before, and no sooner had Margot crossed the threshold than she yielded with pleasure and zest to the fate which had been lying in wait for her long quite enough. And she liked Miller enormously. There was something so satisfying about the grip of his hands, the touch of his thick lips. He did not speak to her much, but he often held her on his knees and laughed quietly as he mused over something unknown. She could not guess what he was doing in Berlin or who he really was, nor could she find out his hotel. And when she once tried searching his pockets, he gave her such a rap on the knuckles that she decided to do it better next time, but he was much too careful. Whenever he went out, she was afraid he would never come back. Otherwise, she was extraordinarily happy, and hoped they would always be together. Now and then he gave her something, silk stockings, a powder puff, nothing very expensive, but he would take her to good restaurants and to the pictures and to a cafe afterward, and once when she gasped as a famous film actor sat down a couple of tables away from them, he looked up at the man, and they exchanged greetings, which made her gasp all the more sweetly. He, for his part, developed such a taste for Margot that often, when he was on the point of going, he would suddenly shove his hat into a corner. Incidentally, she had discovered from its inside that he had been to New York, and decided to stay. All this lasted for exactly 1 month. Then one morning he got up earlier than he usually did and said that he had to leave. She asked him for how long. He stared at her and then walked up and down the room in his purple pajamas, rubbing his hands as though he were washing them. "Forever, I guess," he said suddenly, and he began to dress without looking at her. She thought that he might be joking, kicked off the bedclothes, as the room was very hot, and turned her face to the wall. "Pity I haven't a photo of you," he said as he stumped into his shoes. Then she heard him pack and lock the small suitcase he used for the odds and ends he brought to the flat. After a few minutes he said, "Don't move and don't look around." She did not stir. What was he doing? She twitched her bare shoulder. "Don't move," he repeated. For a couple of minutes there was a silence, except for a faint grating sound which somehow seemed familiar. "Now you may turn," he said, but Margot lay still motionless. He walked up to her, kissed her ear, and went out quickly. The kiss sang in her ear for quite a while. She lay in bed the whole day. He never came back. Next morning she received a wire from Bremen. "Rooms paid till July. Adieu, sweet devil." "Good heavens, how shall I do without him?" said Margot aloud. She leaped to the window, flung it open, and was about to throw herself out. But at that moment a red and gold fire engine drove up, snorting loudly, and stopped in front of the house opposite. A crowd had collected, clouds of smoke billowed from the top window, and black scraps of charred paper floated in the wind. She was so interested in the fire that she forgot her intention. She had very little money left. In her distress she went to a dance hall as abandoned damsels do in films. 2 Japanese gentlemen accosted her, and as she had taken more cocktails than were good for her, she agreed to spend the night with them. Next morning she demanded 200 marks. The Japanese gentleman gave her 350 in small change and bustled her out. She resolved to be more wary in the future. At a bar one night, a fat old man with a nose like an overripe pear put his wrinkled hand on her silken knee and said wistfully, "Glad to meet you again, Dora. Do you still remember what fun we had last summer?" She laughed and replied that he had made a mistake. The old man asked her with a sigh what she would drink. Then he drove her home and became so beastly in the darkness of the car that she jumped out. He followed her and almost in tears begged her to meet him again. She gave him her telephone number. When he had paid for her room till November and also given her enough money to buy a fur coat, she allowed him to stay for the night. He was a comfortable bedfellow, dropping fast asleep the moment he had stopped wheezing. Then he failed to keep an appointment, and when at last she rang up his office, she was told that he was dead. She sold her fur coat, and the money kept her until spring, 2 days before his transaction. She felt an ardent longing to display herself to her parents in her splendor, so she drove past the house in a taxicab. It was a Saturday, and her mother was polishing the handle of the front door. When she saw her daughter, she stopped dead. "Well, I never!" she exclaimed with much feeling. Margot smiled silently, got back into the cab, and through the back window saw her brother come running out of the house. He bawled something after her and shook his fist. She took a cheaper room. Half undressed, her little feet shoeless, she would sit on the edge of her bed in the gathering darkness and smoke endless cigarettes. Her landlady, a sympathetic body, dropped in now and then for a soulful chat, and one day told Margot that a cousin of hers owned a little cinema, which was doing quite well. The winter seemed colder than winters used to be. Margot looked about her for something to pawn. That sunset, perhaps. What shall I do next? She thought. One raw blue morning, when her courage was high, she made up her face very strikingly, looked up a film company with a promising name, and succeeded in making an appointment to see the manager at his office. He turned out to be an elderly man with a black bandage over his right eye and a piercing gleam in his left. Margot began assuring him that she had played before, and very successfully. "What picture?" asked the manager, gazing benevolently at her excited face. Badly, she mentioned a film. The man was silent. Then he closed his left eye. It would have been a week had the other been visible, and said, "Lucky for you that you came across me. Another in my place might have been tempted by your, youth to make you heaps of fine promises, and well, you'd have gone the way of all flesh, never to become the silver ghost of a romance, at least of that special brand of romance which we deal in. I am, as you may observe, no longer young, and what I haven't seen of life isn't worth seeing. My daughter, I imagine, is older than you, and for that reason I would like to tell you something, my dear child. You have never been an actress, and in all likelihood you will never be. Go home, think it over, talk to your parents if you are not on speaking terms with them, which I doubt." Margot slapped the edge of the desk with her glove, stood up, and stalked out, her face distorted with fury. Another company had its office in the same building, but there she was not even admitted. Full of wrath, she made her way home. Her landlady boiled her 2 eggs and patted her shoulders while Margot ate greedily and angrily. Then the good woman fetched some brandy in 2 small glasses, filled them with a shaky hand, carefully corked the bottle, and carried it away. "Here's to your good luck," she said, seating herself again at the rickety table. "Everything will be all right, my dear. I'll be seeing my cousin tomorrow, and we'll have a chat about you." The chat was quite a success, and at first Margot enjoyed her new occupation, though it was, of course, a little humiliating to start her film career in that way. 3 days later she felt as though she had done nothing else all her life but show groping people to their seats. On Friday, however, there was a change of program, and that cheered her up. She stood in the darkness, leaning against the wall, and watched Greta Garbo, but after a while she was fed up for good. Another week by. A man coming out lingered by the exit and glanced at her with a shy, helpless expression. After 2 or 3 nights, he returned. He was perfectly dressed, and his blue eyes stared at her hungrily. Quite a decent-looking fellow, though rather on the dull side, mused Margot. Then when he turned up for the 4th or 5th time, and certainly not for the sake of the picture, because it was the same, she felt a faint thrill of pleasant excitement. But how timid he was, that fellow! As she was leaving for home one night, she noticed him on the other side of the street. She walked slowly on without looking round, but with the corners of her eyes folded back like the ears of a rabbit, expecting that he would follow her, but he did not. He simply faded away. Then, when he came again to the Argus, there was a wan, morbid, very interesting look about him. Her work over, Margot tripped out into the street, stopped, opened her umbrella. There he was, standing again on the opposite sidewalk, and calmly she crossed over to him. But when he saw her approaching, he at once began to walk away. He felt silly and sick. He knew that she was behind, and was so afraid to walk too fast lest he should lose her, but then, too, he was afraid to slacken his pace lest she should overtake him. At the next street crossing, he was obliged to wait while car after car sped past him. Here she overtook him, all but slipped under a bicycle van, and jumped back, colliding with him. He grasped her thin elbow, and they crossed together. "Now it has started," thought Albinus, awkwardly adjusting his stride to hers. He had never walked with so small a woman. "You're drenched," she said with a smile. He took the umbrella out of her hand. She pressed still closer to him. For a moment he feared that his heart might burst, but then suddenly something relaxed delightfully, as though he had caught the tune of his ecstasy, the moist ecstasy drumming against the taut silk overhead. Now his words came freely, and he enjoyed their new-born ease. The rain stopped, but they still walked under the umbrella. When they came to a halt at her front door, he closed the wet, shiny, beautiful thing and gave it back to her. "Don't go away yet," he pleaded, holding while one hand in his pocket and endeavoring to push off his wedding ring with the thumb. "Don't," he repeated. It came off. "Getting late," she said. "My aunt will be angry." He seized her by the wrists and with the violence of shyness tried to kiss her, but she ducked and his lips met only her velvet cap. "Let me go," she murmured, and her head lowered. "You ought to know not to do that." "But don't go," he cried. "I have no one in the world but you." I can't," she answered, and turning the key in the lock, she pressed against the great door with her small shoulder. "I shall wait for you again tomorrow," said Albinus. She smiled at him through the glass pane, and then ran down the dim passage toward the backyard. He took a deep breath, groped for his handkerchief, blew his nose, carefully buttoned and unbuttoned his overcoat, noticed how light and bare his hand felt, and hurriedly slipped on the ring, which was still quite warm. At home nothing had changed, and this seemed remarkable. Elizabeth, Irma, Paul belonged, as it were, to another period, limpid and tranquil, like the backgrounds of the early Italians. Paul, after working all day at his office, liked to pass a quiet evening at his sister's home. He cherished a profound respect for Albinus, for his learning and taste for the beautiful things around him, for the spinach-green goblin in the dining room, a hunt in the forest. When Albinus opened the door of his flat, he felt a queer sinking in the pit of his stomach as he reflected that in a moment he would see his wife. Would she not be able to read his perfidy on his face? For that walk in the rain was betrayal. All that had gone before had only been thoughts and dreams. Perhaps by some dreadful mischance his actions had been observed and reported. Perhaps he smelt of cheap, sweet scent she used. As he stepped into the hall, he swiftly concocted in his mind a story that might come in handy. A young artist, her poverty, her talent, and how he was trying to help her. But nothing had changed, neither wide door behind which his daughter was sleeping at the end of the passage, nor his brother-in-law's vast overcoat which was hanging in its coat hanger, a special hanger wound in red silk, as calmly and respectable as ever. He entered the sitting room. Here they were, Elizabeth in her familiar tweed dress with checks, Paul puffing at a cigar, and an old lady of their acquaintance, a baron's widow, who had been impoverished by the inflation and now carried on a small business in rugs and pictures. No matter what they were discussing, the rhythm of everyday life was so comforting that he felt a spasm of joy. He had not been found out. And then later, as he lay by his wife's side in their bedroom, dimly lit, quietly furnished, without as usual a part of the central heating apparatus painted white reflected in the mirror, Albinus marveled at his own divided nature. His affection for Elizabeth was perfectly secure and undiminished, but at the same time there burned in his mind the thought that perhaps no later than tomorrow, yes, certainly tomorrow, but it did not prove quite so easy. At their next meetings, Margot skillfully contrived to avoid his lovemaking, and there was not the slightest chance of his being able to take her to a hotel. She did not tell him much about herself, only that she was an orphan, the daughter of a painter. Curious coincidence, that, and lived with her aunt. And she was very hard up, but longed to give her her exhausting job. Albinus had introduced himself to her under the hurriedly assumed name of Schiffer-Miller. And Margot thought bitterly, another Miller already, and then, oh, you're lying, of course. March was rainy. These nocturnal strolls under the umbrella tortured Albinus, and he soon suggested they go to a cafe. She selected a dingy little place where he felt sure of not meeting any acquaintances. It was his habit when settling down at a table to lay out at once his cigarette case and lighter. On the case, Margot espied his initials. She said nothing, but after a little reflection asked him to fetch her the telephone book. While he was walking toward the booth with his slow, flopping gait, she took up his hat from the chair and swiftly examined its lining. There was his name. He had put it there in order to thwart absent-minded artists at parties. Presently he came back with a telephone directory, holding it like a Bible, smiling tenderly, and while he was gazing at her long drooping lashes, Margot sped through the R's and found Albinus's address with his telephone number. Then she quietly closed the well-thumbed blue volume. "Take off your coat," muttered Albinus. Without bothering to stand up, she began to wriggle out of the sleeves, inclining her pretty neck and thrusting forward first the right, then the left shoulder. As Albinus helped her, he caught a hot whiff of violets and saw her shoulder blades move, the sallow skin between them ripple and smooth out again. Then she took off her hat, peered into her pocket mirror, and wetting her forefinger, tapped the black love locks on her temples. Albinus sat down beside her and looked at that face in which everything was so charming, the burning cheeks, the lips glistening from the cherry brandy, the childish solemnity of the long hazel eyes, and the small downy mole on the soft curve just beneath the left one. If I knew I should hang for it, he thought, I would still look at her. Even that vulgar Berlin slang of hers only enhanced the charm of her throaty voice and large white teeth. While laughing, she half closed her eyes, and a dimple danced on her cheek. He pawed at her little hand, but she withdrew it briskly. You're driving me crazy, he said. Margot patted his cuff and said, Now be a good boy. His first thought next morning was, It can't go on like this. It just can't. I must get her a room. Curse that aunt. We shall be alone, quite alone. A textbook of love for beginners. Oh, the things I shall teach her. So young, so pure, so maddening. Are you asleep? Asked Elizabeth softly. He achieved the perfect yawn and opened his eyes. Elizabeth was seated in her pale blue nightgown on the edge of a double bed and was looking through the mail. Anything interesting? Asked Albinus, gazing in dull wonder at the white shoulder. Ach, he asks you for money again, says his wife and mother-in-law have been ill, and that people are plotting against him, says he can't afford to buy paints. We'll have to help him again, I suppose. Yes, of course, said Albinus, and in his mind there formed an extraordinary vivid picture of Margot's dead father. He, too, no doubt, had been a seedy, bad-tempered, and not very gifted artist whom life had treated harshly. And here's an invitation to the Artists' Club. We shall have to go this time, and here's a letter from the States. Read it aloud, he asked. My dear sir, I am afraid I have not much news to convey, but there still are a few things I should like to add to my long letter, which in parentheses you have not answered yet, as I may be coming in the fall. At that moment the telephone rang on the bedside table. Tut-tut, said Elizabeth, and leaned forward. Albinus followed absent-mindedly the movements of her delicate fingers as they took and clasped the white receiver. Then he heard the tiny ghost of a voice speaking at the other end. Oh, good morning, exclaimed Elizabeth, at the same time making a certain face at her husband, a sure sign that it was the Baroness talking, and talking a lot. He stretched out his hand for the American letter and glanced at the date. Funny he had not yet answered the last one. Irma came in to greet her parents, as she did every morning. Silently she kissed her father, and then her mother, who was listening to the telephone tale with closed eyes, grunting every now and then in misplaced assent of feigned astonishment. See that you are a very good little girl today, whispered Albinus to his daughter. With a smile, Irma disclosed a fistful of marbles. She was not at all pretty. Freckles covered her pale, bumpy forehead. Her eyelashes were much too fair, her nose too long for her face. By all means, said Elizabeth, and sighed with relief as she hung up. Albinus prepared to go on with the letter. Elizabeth held her daughter by the wrist and was telling her something funny, laughing, kissing her and giving her a little tug after every sentence. Irma went on smiling demurely as she shuffled with her shoe on the floor. Again the telephone rang. This time Albinus attended to it. Good morning, Albert dear, said a feminine voice. Who? Began Albinus, and suddenly he had the sickening sensation of going down a very fast lift. It was not particularly nice of you to give me a false name, pursued the voice, but I forgive you. I just wanted to tell you— Wrong number, said Albinus hoarsely, and crushed back the receiver. At the same time he reflected with dismay that Elizabeth might have heard something, just as he had heard the Baroness's minute voice. What was it? She asked. Why have you turned so red? Absurd, Irma, my child. Run along. Don't fidget about like that. Utterly absurd. That's the 10th wrong call in 2 days. He writes that he'll probably be coming here at the end of the year. I'll be glad to see him. Who writes? Good God, you never get what one's saying. That man from America. That fellow Rex. What Rex? Asked Elizabeth unconcernedly. 5. Their meeting that night was a tempestuous one. Albinus stayed home all day because he was in a panic that she might ring up again. When she emerged from the Argus, he greeted her incontentedly with, Look here, child, I forbid you to ring me up. It won't do. If I did not give you my name, I had my reasons for it. Oh, that's all right. I'm through with you, said Margot blandly, and walked away. He stood there and stared after her helplessly. What an he was. He ought to have held his tongue. Then she'd have fancied that she made a mistake after all. Albinus overtook her and walked along by her side. Forgive me, he said. Don't be cross with me, Margot. I can't live without you. Look here. I've thought it all over. Drop your job. I'm rich. You shall have your own room, your flat, anything you like. You're a liar, coward, and fool, said Margot, summoning up rather neatly. And you're married, and that's why you hide that ring in your mackintosh pocket. Oh, of course you're married, else you wouldn't have been so rude on the phone. And if I am, he asked, won't you meet me any more? What does it matter to me? Deceive her. It'll do her good. Margot, stop, groaned Albinus. Leave me alone. Margot, listen to me. It is true. I have a family, but please stop jeering about it. Oh, don't go away, he cried, catching her, missing her, clutching at her shabby little handbag. Go to H, she shouted, and banged the door in his face. 6. I'd like my fortune told, said Margot to her landlady, and the latter took out from behind the empty beer bottles a decrepit pack of cards which most had watched their corners so that they looked almost circular. A rich man with dark hair, troubles, a feast, a long journey. I must find out how he lives, thought Margot, her elbows resting on the table. Perhaps, after all, he is not really wealthy, and it's not worth my while to bother about him. Or shall I risk it? The next morning at exactly the same time she rang him up again. Elizabeth was in her bath. Albinus spoke almost in a whisper with his eye on the door. Although sick with fear, he was madly happy to be forgiven. "My darling," she murmured. "My darling, say what time will Leify be away from home?" she asked, laughing. "I'm afraid I don't know," he answered with a cold shiver. "Why?" "I'd like to drop in for a moment." He was silent. Somewhere a door opened. "I can't go on talking," murmured Albinus. "If I come to you, I might kiss you. Today I don't know. No," he stammered. "I don't think it's feasible. If I suddenly ring off, don't be surprised. I shall see you tonight, and then we'll—" He hung up and sat for some time motionless, listening to the pounding of his heart. "I suppose I am a coward," he thought. "She's sure to dawdle in the bathroom for another half-hour." "One small request," he said to Margot when they met. "Let's take a taxi." "An open one," said Margot. "No, that's too dangerous. I promise I'll behave," he added as he gazed lovingly at her childishly upturned face, which looked very white in the blaze of the street lamp. "Listen," he began when they were seated in the cab. "First, I am not angry with you, of course, for ringing me up, but I beg you, I implore you, do not do it again, my darling, my precious. That's better," thought Margot. "And secondly, tell me how you found my name." She lied quite needlessly, telling him that a woman she knew had seen him in the street together and knew him too. "Who was it?" asked Albinus with horror. "Oh, just a working woman. I think one of your sisters was once cook or housemaid in your family." Albinus racked his memory despairingly. "Anyway, I told her she was wrong. I'm a smart little girl." The darkness inside the taxi slid and swayed as the corners and halves of the whole squares of ashen light passed from window to window across it. Margot was sitting so near that he felt the blissful animal warmth of her body. "I shall die or go off my head if I can't have her," thought Albinus. "And thirdly," he said aloud, "find yourself lodgings, say 2 or 3 rooms and a kitchen. That is, upon condition that you let me visit you occasionally." "Albert, have you already forgotten what I suggested this morning?" "But it's so risky," groaned Albinus. "You see, tomorrow, for instance, I'll be alone from about 4 to 6, but one never knows what may happen," and he pictured to himself how his wife might come back for something she had forgotten. "But I've told you I'd kiss you," said Margot softly, "and then, you know, there's not a thing in the world that can be explained in some way, somehow." So next day, when Elizabeth and Irma had gone out for tea, he sent Frida the maid, it was the cook's day out luckily, on a good long errand with a couple of books to deliver miles away. Now he was alone. His watch had stopped some minutes ago, but the clock on the dining room was exact, and then, too, by craning out of the window, he could see the church clock. 4:15. It was a bright windy day in mid-April. On the sunlit wall of the opposite house, the fast shadow of smoke ran sideways from the shadow of the chimney. The asphalt was drying patchily after a recent shower, the damp still showing in the form of grotesque black skeletons as if painted across the width of the road. 4:30, she might come at any minute. Whenever he thought of Margot's slim girlish figure, her silky skin, the touch of her funny, ill-kept little hands, he felt a rush of desire which was almost painful. Now the vision of the promised kiss filled him with such ecstasy that it seemed hardly possible it could be still further intensified, and yet beyond it, down a vista of mirrors, there was still to be reached the dim white form of her body, that very form which art students had sketched so conscientiously and so badly. But of those dull hours in the studio, Albinus suspected nothing, although by a queer trick of fate he had unwittingly seen her nude form already. The family doctor, old Lampert, had showed him some charcoal drawings which his son had made 2 years ago, and among them was a girl with bobbed hair, her feet curled under her on the rug where she sat, leaning off her stiff arm, her shoulder touching her cheek. "No, I think I prefer the hunchback," he had remarked, turning back to another sheet on which a bearded cripple was depicted. "Yes, it is a great pity he has given up art," he had added, closing the portfolio. 10 minutes to 5. She was already 20 minutes late. "I'll wait until 5, then go out," he murmured. Suddenly he saw her. She was crossing the street without coat or hat, as though she lived round the corner. Still time to run down and tell her it's getting too late now. But instead of doing so, Albinus tiptoed breathlessly into the hall, and when he heard the childish stamping of her footsteps coming up the stairs, he noiselessly opened the door. Margot, in her short red frock with bare arms, smiled into the mirror and then twirled round on her heel as she smoothed the back of her head. "You do live in style," she said, her beaming eyes roaming over the hall with its large, rich pictures, its porcelain vase in the corner, and that cream-colored cretonne instead of wallpaper. "This way?" she asked, and pushed open a door. "Oh," she said. He laid one trembling hand round her waist, and with her he looked up at the crystal chandelier, as though he himself were a stranger, but he saw it all through a swimming haze. She crossed her feet and rocked gently as she stood there, her eyes roaming. "You are rich," she said as they entered the next room. "Heaven, what rugs!" She was so overcome by the sideboard in the dining room that Albinus was able to finger her ribs stealthily, and above them, a hot, soft muscle. "Let's go on," she said eagerly. In a passing mirror he saw a pale, grave gentleman Walking beside a schoolgirl in her Sunday dress, cautiously he stroked her smooth arm, and the glass grew dim. "Come on," said Margot. He wanted to get her back into the study. Then, if his wife came back earlier than he expected, it would be simple, a young artist in want of help. "And what's in there?" she asked. "That's the nursery. You've seen everything now." "Let me go," she said, moving her shoulders. He drew a deep breath. "It's the nursery, my darling, only the nursery. There's nothing to see." But she went inside, and he suddenly felt a strange impulse to shout at her, "Please don't touch anything." But she was already holding a purple plush elephant. He snatched it away and shoved it into her corner. Margot laughed. "Your little girl is in clover here," she said. Then she opened the next door. "That's enough, Margot," Albinus pleaded. "We are getting too far from the hall. We shan't hear the front door. It's dreadfully dangerous." But she shook him off like a naughty child and slipped through the passage into the bedroom. There she seated herself in front of the mirror. Mirrors were having plenty of work that day. Turned a silver-backed brush in her hand, sniffed at a silver-stoppered bottle. "Oh, don't!" cried Albinus. She swerved by him neatly, ran to the double bed, seated herself on the edge. She pulled up her stocking like a child, made the garter snap, and showed him the tip of her tongue. "And then I'll kill myself," thought Albinus, suddenly losing his head. He lurched toward her, his arms open, but she bounded past him with a chirrup of glee and bolted out of the room. He made a belated dash after her. Margot slammed the door and, panting and laughing, turned the key from outside. Oh, how the poor fat woman had banged and thumped and yelled. "Margot, open at once," said Albinus softly. He heard her footsteps dancing away. "Open," he repeated in a louder voice. Silence. The little vixen, he thought. What an absurd situation. He was frightened. He was hot. He was not used to bouncing about rooms. He was in an agony of thwarted desire. Had she really gone? No, someone was walking about the flat. He tried some keys he had in his pocket, then, losing his temper, shook the door violently. "Open at once, do you hear?" The footsteps drew near. It was not Margot. "Hello, what's the matter?" asked an unexpected voice. "Paul's. Are you locked in? Shall I let you out?" The door opened. Paul looked alarmed. "What has happened, old man?" he repeated, and gaped at the hairbrush lying on the floor. "Oh, a ridiculous thing. Tell you in a moment. Let's have a glass of something." "You have given me the devil of a shock," said Paul. "I could not think what on earth had happened. Luckily I came along. Elizabeth told me she'd be home about 6. Lucky I was rather early. Who locked you in?" "Not your maid gone mad, I hope." Albinus stood with his back to him and busied himself with the brandy. "Didn't you meet anybody on the stairs?" he asked, trying to speak distinctly. "I took the lift," said Paul. Saved, thought Albinus, his spirits reviving considerably, but how dangerously foolish to have forgotten that Paul, too, had a key to the flat. "Would you believe it?" he said as he slipped the bandy. "A burglar broke in. Don't tell Elizabeth, of course, though thought there was no one at home, I suspect. Suddenly I heard the front door behaving oddly. I came out of my study to see what it was clicking, and there was a man slipping in the bedroom. I followed him and tried to grab him, but he sort of doubled back and locked me in. It's a great pity he escaped. I thought you might have met him." "You're joking," said Paul, aghast. "No, not at all. I was in my study and heard the front door clicking, so I went to see what it was, but he may have stolen something. Let's look, and we must inform the police." "Oh, he hadn't had time," said Albinus. "It all happened in a second, and I scared him away." "What did he look like?" "Oh, just a man with a cap, a largish man, very strong-looking." "He could have hurt you. What a very unpleasant experience. Come on, we must have a look round." Then they went through the rooms, examined locks. Everything was in order. It was only at the end of their investigations, as they were walking through the library, that suddenly a pang of horror shot through Albinus. There, in a corner between the shelves, just behind a revolving bookstand, the edge of a bright red frock was showing. By some miracle, Paul did not see it, although he was nosing about conscientiously. There was a collection of miniatures in the next room, and he pored over the inclined glass. "That's enough, Paul," said Albinus huskily. "There's no point going on. It's quite clear he hasn't taken anything." "How shaken you look," exclaimed Paul, as they returned to the study. "My poor chap, look here, you must have your lock changed or always keep the door bolted. And what about the police?" "Would you like me to—" "Shh," hissed Albinus. Voices drew near, and Elizabeth came in, followed by Irma, her nurse, and one of her little friends, a fat child who, in spite of her shy, stolid expression, could be most boisterous. Albinus felt as if it were all a nightmare. Margot's presence in the house was monstrous, unbearable. The maid returned with the books she had not found in the address, and no wonder. The nightmare grew wilder. He suggested going to the theater that night, and Elizabeth was tired. At supper he was so busy straining his ears for any suspicious rustle that he did not notice what he was eating, cold beef, in fact, with pickles. Paul kept on looking around, giving out little coughs or humming. If only, thought Albinus, the meddlesome fool would remain in his place and not potter about, but there was another dreadful possibility. The children might start romping through all the rooms, and he dared not go and lock the door of the library. That might lead to unimaginable complications. Thank God Irma's little friend soon left, and Irma popped to bed. But the tension remained. He felt as if they all, Elizabeth, Paul, the maid, and himself, were sprawling over the whole place instead of keeping huddled together as they should in order to give Margot a chance of slipping out if indeed she had that intention. At length, at about 11 o'clock, Paul left. As usual, Frida chained and bolted the door. Now Margot could not get out. "I'm awfully sleepy," said Albinus to his wife, and yawned nervously, and then could not stop yawning. They went to bed. In the house all was silent. Elizabeth was just about to turn out the light. "You get to sleep," he said. "I think I'll go read a bit." She smiled drowsily, heedless of his inconsistency. "Don't wake me up when you come," she murmured. Everything was too quiet to be natural. It seemed as if the silence was rising, would suddenly brim over and break into laughter. He had slipped out of bed, and his night suit and felt slippers were walking noiselessly down the passage. Strange, all dread had gone. The nightmare had melted into the keen, sweet sensation of absolute freedom, peculiar to sinful dreams. Albinus undid the neck of his pajamas as he crept along. He was trembling all over. In a moment she will be mine, he thought. Softly he opened the door of the library and turned on the softly shaded light. "Margot, you mad little thing," he whispered feverishly. But it was only a scarlet silk cushion which he himself had brought there a few days ago to crouch on while consulting Nabokhov's History of Art, 10 volumes, folio. "7. Margot informed her landlady that she would soon be leaving. It was all going splendidly. In this flat she had realized the soundness of her admirer's wealth. Also, to judge by the photograph on his bed table, his wife was not at all as she had imagined her, a large, stately woman with a grim expression and a grip of iron. On the contrary, she seemed a quiet, vague sort of creature who could be got out of the way without much trouble. And she quite liked Albinus. He was a well-groomed gentleman, smelling of talcum powder and good tobacco. Of course, she could not hope for a repetition of the ecstasy of her first love affair, but she would not let herself think of Miller, of his chalk-white, hollow cheeks, unkempt black hair, and long, skillful hands. Albinus could soothe her and allay her fever, like those cool plantain leaves, which it is so comforting to apply to an inflamed spot. Then there was something else. He was not only well-to-do, but he also belonged to a world which afforded easy access to a stage in the films. Often, behind her locked door, she would make all sorts of wonderful faces for the benefit of her dressing-chest mirror, or recoil before the barrel of an imaginary revolver, and it seemed to her that she simpered and sneered as well as any screen actress. After a thorough and painstaking search, she found quite a pretty suite of rooms in a very good neighborhood. Albinus was so upset after her visit that she felt sorry for him and made no further difficulty about taking the fat wad of notes which he crammed into her bag during their evening walk. Moreover, she let him kiss her in the shelter of a porch. The fire of this kiss was still around him like a colored glory when he returned home. He could not lay it aside in the hall, as he did his black felt hat, and when he came into the bedroom he thought that his wife must see that halo. But it never even occurred to Elizabeth, placid 35-year-old Elizabeth, that her husband might deceive her. She knew that he had little adventures before his marriage, and she had remembered that she herself, as a small girl, had been secretly in love with an old actor who used to visit her father and enliven dinner with beautiful imitations of farmyard sounds. She had heard and read that husbands and wives constantly deceived one another. Indeed, adultery was the core of gossip, romantic poetry, funny stories, and famous operas, but she was quite simply and steadfastly convinced that her own marriage was a very special, precious, and pure tie that could never be broken. Her husband's evenings out, which he explained were spent with some artist interested in that cinema idea of his, never afforded her the least suspicion. His irritability and jumpiness she put down to the weather, which was quite unusual for May. At one moment it was hot, at the next there would be icy torrents of rain mixed with the hailstones, which bounced on the windowsills like tiny tennis balls. "Shall we go for a trip somewhere?" she suggested casually one day. "Tyrol? Rome?" "You go if you want to," replied Albinus. "I have lots to do, my dear." "Oh no, it was just a fancy," she said, and set off with Irma to the zoo to see the baby elephant, which turned out to have hardly any trunk at all, and a fringe of short hair standing on end along its back. With Paul it was a different matter. The episode of the locked door left him with a strange uneasiness. Albinus had not only failed to notify the police, but he was actually annoyed when Paul returned to the subject, so Paul could not help brooding over the thing. He tried to recall whether he had perhaps seen any suspicious character when he came into the house and walked toward the lift. He was very observant, he thought. He had, for instance, noticed a cat which sprang as he passed and slithered between the bars of the garden railings, a schoolgirl in red, for whom he had opened the door. A broadcast laughter and song from the porter's lodge, where the wireless was turned on as usual. Yes, the burglar must have run down while he was going up the lift, but what gave him that nasty feeling? His sister's married happiness was to him a sacred thing. When some days later he was put through the telephone to Albinus while the latter was still talking, and so overheard certain words, Fate's classical method, eavesdropping, he almost swallowed a piece of matchwood with which he was picking his teeth. "Don't ask me, just buy what you like. But don't you see, Albert," said a vulgar, capricious, feminine voice. With a shudder, Paul hung up the receiver, as though he'd inadvertently caught hold of a snake. That evening, as he sat with his sister and brother-in-law, he could not think of anything to talk about. He just sat there, self-conscious and fidgety, rubbing his chin, crossing and recrossing his plump legs, looking at his watch and putting the blank handless thing back into his waistcoat pocket. He was one of those sensitive beings who blush guiltily when someone else makes a blunder. Could this man whom he loved and revered, be deceiving Elizabeth? No, it's a mistake, some silly misunderstanding, he kept telling himself, as he glanced at Albinus, who was reading a book with unruffled countenance, clearing his throat now and then and very carefully cutting the pages with an ivory paper knife. Impossible, that locked bedroom door put it into my mind. The words I hear doubtless admit of some innocent explanation. How could anyone deceive Elizabeth? She was cuddled in a corner of the sofa, relating slowly and minutely the plot of a play which she had seen. Her pale eyes, with the faint freckles under them, were as candid as her mother's had been, and her unpowdered nose alone pathetically. Paul nodded his head and smiled. She might have been speaking Russian for all he knew. Then suddenly, for 1 second only, he caught sight of Albinus's eyes looking at him over the book he was holding. Meanwhile, Margot had rented the flat and proceeded to buy a number of household articles, beginning with a refrigerator. Although Albinus paid up handsomely, and even with a certain pleasurable emotion, he was giving the money on trust, for not only had he seen the flat, he did not even know its address. She had told him that it would be such fun if he did not see her home until it was complete. A week passed. He fancied that she would ring him up on Saturday. The whole day he mounted guard over the telephone, but it gleamed and was mute. On Monday he decided that she had tricked him, had vanished forever. In the evening Paul came. These visits were hell for both of them by now. Still worse, Elizabeth was not at home. Paul sat in the study opposite Albinus and smoked, looked at the tip of his cigar. He had become even thinner of late. He knows everything, thought Albinus dismally. Well, and what if he does? He's a man. He ought to understand. Irma trotted in, and Paul's countenance brightened. He took her on his lap and produced a funny little grunt as she prodded him with her small fist in the stomach while making herself comfortable. Then Elizabeth returned from the bridge tea. The thought of supper and a long evening afterward suddenly seemed to Albinus more than he could endure. He announced that he was not supping at home. His wife asked him good-naturedly why he had not said so before. He had only one wish, to find Margot immediately, no matter what the cost. Destiny, which had promised him so much, had not the right to cheat him now. He was so desperate that he resolved upon a very daring step. He knew where her old room was, and he knew that she had lived there with her aunt. Thither he went. As he walked through the backyard, he saw a servant girl making the bed at an open window on the ground floor and questioned her. "Fraulein Peters?" She repeated, holding the pillow she had been thumping. "Oh, I think she has moved. I think you better see for yourself. 5th floor, door on the left." A slatternly woman with bloodshot eyes opened the door a little way without taking off the chain and asked what he wanted. "I want to know Fraulein Peters' new address. She used to live here with her aunt." "Oh, did she?" said the woman with sudden interest, and now she unhooked the chain. She led him into a tiny parlor, all the objects in which shook and rattled at the least movement. On a piece of American cloth with brown circular stains stood a plate of mashed potatoes, salt in a torn paper bag, and 3 empty beer bottles. With a mysterious smile, she invited him to be seated. "If I was her aunt," she said with a wink, "I'd not be likely to know her address. No," she added with a certain vehemence, "she hasn't got no aunt." Drunk, thought Albinus wearily. "Look here," he said, "can't you tell me where she has gone?" "She rented a room from me," said the woman pensively, as she bitterly reflected on Margot's ingratitude in hiding from her both the rich friend and her new address, though there had not been much difficulty in sniffing out a letter. "What can I do?" exclaimed Albinus. "Can't you suggest anything?" Yes, sadly ungrateful. She had helped her so. Now she did not know whether by telling she would be doing Margot a service or the reverse. She would have preferred the second. But this big, nervous, blue-eyed gentleman looked so unhappy that with a sigh she told him what he wanted to know. "They used to be after me, too, in the old days," she muttered, nodding her head while she let him out. "They did." In 7:30, lights were being put out, and soft orange glow looked very lovely on the pale dusk. The sky was still quite blue, with a single salmon-colored cloud in the distance, and all this unsteady balance between light and dusk made Albinus feel giddy. In another moment I shall be in paradise, he thought as he sped in a taxi over the whispering asphalt. 3 tall poplars grew in front of the big brick house where she now lived. A brand-new brass plate with her name was affixed to her door. A huge female with arms like lumps of raw meat went to announce him. "Got a cook already," he thought lovingly. "Walk in," said the cook, coming back. He smoothed down his sparse hair and went in. Margot was lying in a kimono on a dreadful chintz-covered sofa, her arms crossed behind her head. On her stomach an open book was poised, cover upward. "You're quick," she said languidly, extending her hand. "Why don't you seem surprised to see me?" He murmured softly. "Guess how I found out your address." "I wrote you my address," she said with a sigh, raising both elbows again. It was rather amusing, Albinus continued without heeding her words, just gloating over the sight of her painted lips, which, in another moment, "Rather amusing, especially as you've been pulling my leg with that ready-made aunt of yours." "Why did you go there?" inquired Margot, suddenly very cross. "I wrote you my address in the top right-hand corner, quite clearly." "Top corner, clearly?" repeated Albinus, puckering up his face perplexedly. "What on earth are you talking about?" She shut the book with a bang and sat up on the couch. "Surely you got my letter." "What letter?" asked Albinus, and suddenly he put his hand to his mouth and his eyes opened very wide. "I sent you a letter this morning," she said, settling down again and gazing at him curiously. "I reckoned you'd get it by the evening post and come to see me straight away." "You didn't," cried Albinus. "Of course I did, and I can tell you exactly what it was I wrote. Darling Albert, the wee nest is ready, and Bertie is waiting for you. Only don't hug me too hard, or you'll turn your baby's head more than ever. That's about all." "Margot," he whispered hoarsely. "Margot, what have you done? I left home before I could possibly get it. The postman, he doesn't come until 7:15. Well, that's no fault of mine," she said. "Really, you are hard to please. It was such a sweet letter." She shrugged her shoulders, picked up the book, and turned her back to him. On the right-hand page was a photographic study of Greta Garbo. Albinus found himself thinking, how strange, a disaster occurs and still a man notices a picture. 20 minutes to 8. Margot lay there, her body curved and motionless like a lizard. "You've shattered—" he began at the top of his voice, but he did not end his sentence. He ran out, rushed downstairs, jumped into a cab, and while he sat on the very edge of the seat, leaning forward, winning a few inches that way, he stared at the back of the driver, and that back was hopeless. He arrived, he jumped out, he paid his men due in films, blindly thrusting out a coin. By the garden railing he saw the familiar figure of the gaunt, knock-kneed postman talking to the short, stout hall porter. "Any letters for me?" asked Albinus breathlessly. "I've just delivered them, sir," answered the postman with a friendly grin. Albinus looked up. The windows of his flat were brightly lit, all of them, an unusual thing. With a tremendous effort he entered the house and began to go upstairs. He reached the first landing and the second. "Let me explain, a young artist in need. Not quite right in the head, writes love letters to strangers. Nonsense, the game was up." Before reaching his door he suddenly turned round and was rushed down again. A cat crossed the garden path and slipped nimbly between the iron bars. 10 minutes later he was back in the room which he had entered so gaily a short while ago. Margot was still curved on the couch in the same posture, a torpid lizard. The book was still open at the same page. Albinus sat down a little distance from her and began to crack his finger joints. "Don't do that," said Margot without raising her head. He stopped but soon began again. "Well, has the letter come?" "Oh, Margot," he said, and cleared his throat several times. "Too late, too late," he cried in a new shrill voice. He rose, walked up and down the room, blew his nose, and sat down on the chair again. "She reads all my letters," he said, gazing through a moist haze at the toe of his shoe and trying to fit it in the trembling pattern of the carpet. "Well, you ought to have forbidden her to do that. Margot, you don't understand. It was always like that. A habit, a pleasure. Mislaid them sometimes before I'd read them. There were all sorts of amusing letters. How could you do it? I can't imagine what she'll do now, if by a miracle, just this once. Perhaps she was busy with something, perhaps no. Well, mind you don't slow yourself when she comes along here. I'll see her alone, in the hall." "Who? When?" he asked, dully remembered the drunken hag he had seen ages ago. "When? Any moment, I suppose. She's got my address now, hasn't she?" Albinus still failed to understand. "Oh, that's what you mean," he muttered at last. "How silly you are, Margot. Believe me, that at any rate it is utterly impossible. Anything else, but not that. So much the better," thought Margot, and suddenly she felt extremely elated when she had sent off the letter as she had anticipated a far more trivial consequence. "He refuses to show it. Wife gets wild, stamps, has a fit. So the first suspicions are aroused, and that eases the way. But now chance had helped her, and the way was made clear at one stroke." She let the book slip to the floor and smiled as she looked at the downcast, twitching face. It was time to act, she supposed. Margot stretched herself out, was aware of a pleasant tingling in her slim body, and said, gazing up at the ceiling, "Come here." He came, sat down on the edge of the couch, and shook his head despondently. "Kiss me," she said, closing her eyes. "I'll comfort you." 9. Berlin West, a morning in May. Men in white caps cleaning the street. Who are they who would leave old patent leather boots in the gutter? Sparrows bustling about in the ivy. An electric milk van on fat tires rolling creamily. The sun dazzling in an attic window on the slope of a green-tiled roof. The young fresh air itself was not used to the hooting of distant traffic. It gently took up the sounds and bore them along like some fragile and precious. In the front gardens the Persian lilac was in bloom. Despite the early coolness, white butterflies were already fluttering about, as though in a rustic garden. All these things surrounded Albinus as he walked out of the house in which he had spent the night. He was conscious of a dull discomfort. He was hungry. He had neither shaved nor bathed. The touch of yesterday's shirt against his skin was exasperating. He felt utterly spent, and no wonder. This had been the night of which he had dreamed for years. The very way in which she had drawn her shoulder blades together and purred when he first kissed her downy back had told him that he would get exactly what he wanted, and that what he wanted was not the chill of innocence. As in his most reckless visions, everything was permissible. A Puritan's love, priggish reserve, was less known in this new free world than White Bear's in Honolulu. Her nudity was as natural as though she had long been wont to run along the shore of his dreams. There was something delightfully acrobatic in her bed manners. And afterward she would skip out and prance up and down the room, swinging her girlish hips and gnawing at a dry roll left over from supper. She fell asleep quite suddenly, as though she had stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence, when the electric light was already turning a death cell yellow and the window a ghostly blue. He made his way to the bathroom, but only a few drops of rust-colored water could be coaxed from the tap. He sighed, picked up a dejected loofah out of the bath, with 2 fingers dropped it in gingerly, examined the slippery pink soap, and reflected that he must instruct Margot in the rules of cleanliness. His teeth chattering, he dressed, spread the eiderdown over Margot, who was sweetly sleeping, kissed her warm, tousled dark hair, left a penciled note on the table, and stepped softly out. Now, as he strolled along in the mild sunshine, he realized that the reckoning was about to begin. When he saw again the house in which he had lived for so long with Elizabeth, he went up in the lift, in which the nurse with his baby in his arms and wife, looking very pale and happy, had gone up 8 years before. When he stood before the door, upon which his scholarly name gleamed sedately, Albinus was almost prepared to renounce any repetition of the previous night, if only a miracle had happened. He was sure that Elizabeth had not read the letter. He would be able to explain his absence somehow. He might say he had tried in jest smoking opium at the rooms of that Japanese artist who had once come to dinner. That would be quite possible. But now he had to open the door, walk in, and see. What would he see? Would it not be the best, perhaps, not to enter at all, just to leave everything as it was, to desert, to vanish? He suddenly remembered how during the war he had forced himself not to stoop so much when leaving cover. In the hall he stood motionless, listening. Not a sound. Usually at this hour of the morning the flat was full of noises. Somewhere water would be running, the nurse would be talking loudly to Irma, the maid rattling crockery in the dining room. Not a sound. In the corner stood Elizabeth's umbrella. He tried to find some comfort in that. All at once he stood there. Frida, apronless, appeared from the passage, stared at him, and then said wretchedly, "Oh, sir, they all went away last night." "Where?" asked Albinus, not looking at her. She told him everything. She spoke fast and unusually loudly. Then she burst into tears as she shook his hat and stick. "Will you have some coffee?" she wailed. The disorder in the bedroom told its tale. His wife's evening gowns lay on the bed. One drawer of its chest was pulled out. The little portrait of his late father-in-law had vanished from the table. The corner of the rug was turned up. Albinus turned it back and walked quietly to the study. Some open letters lay on the desk. Ah, there it was. What childish handwriting. Bad spelling. Bad spelling. An invitation for lunch from the Dryers. How nice! A short letter from Rex. The dentist's bill. Splendid. 2 hours later Paul appeared. I see he has shaved himself clumsily, crisscross on his plump cheek, with some black sticking plaster. "I've come for the things," he said as he went by. Albinus followed him, jingling coins in his trousers pocket, and looked on in silence while he and Frida hastily packed the trunk as though they were in a hurry to catch a train. "Don't forget the umbrella," said Albinus vaguely. Then he followed them again in the packing, and was repeated in the nursery. In the Fräulein's room, a portmanteau stood ready. They took that too. "Paul, just a word," murmured Albinus, and he cleared his throat and went into the study. Paul came in and stood by the window. "This is a tragedy," said Albinus. "Let me tell you one thing," exclaimed Paul at length, staring out of the window. "It will be exceedingly lucky if Elizabeth survives the shock. He broke off. The black cross on his cheek went up and down. "She's like a dead woman, as it is. You are, in fact, you're a scoundrel, sir, an absolute scoundrel." "Aren't you being rather rude?" said Albinus, trying to smile. "It's monstrous," shouted Paul, looking at his brother-in-law for the first time. "Where did you pick her up? How did this prostitute dare to write to you?" Gently, gently, said Albinus, and licked his lips. I'll thrash you. I'm hanged if I don't, shouted Paul still louder. Remember Frida, muttered Albinus. She can hear every word. Will you give me an answer? Said Paul tried to catch hold of the lapel of his coat, but Albinus, with a sickly grin, slapped him on the hand. I refuse to be cross-examined, he whispered. All this extremely painful. Can't you think it some dreadful misunderstanding? Suppose you're lying, roared Paul, thumping the floor with a chair. You cod. I've just been to see her. A little harlot, you ought to be in a reformatory. I knew you'd lie, you cad. How could you do such a thing? This is not a mere vice, That's enough, Albinus interrupted almost inaudibly. A motor lorry drove past. The window panes rattled slightly. Oh, Albert, said Paul, in an unexpectedly calm and melancholy tone. Who would have thought it? He went out. Frida was sobbing in the wings. Someone carried out the luggage. Then all was silent. 10. That afternoon, Albinus packed his suitcase and drove to Margot's rooms. It had not been easy to persuade Frida to remain in the empty flat. Finally, she agreed when he proposed to her young man, a worthy police sergeant, should occupy what had once been the nurse's bedroom, and if anyone rang up, she was to say that Albinus had unexpectedly left for Italy with his family. Margot received him coldly. That morning she had been roused by the fat, irate gentleman who was looking for his brother-in-law. He had called her names. The cook, a particularly hefty woman, had pushed him out, thank goodness. This flat's really only meant for one person, she said, glancing at Albinus's suitcase. Oh, please, he murmured miserably. Anyway, there's a lot of things we must talk about. I've no intention of listening to the insults of your idiotic relations. And she walked up and down the room in her red silk wrapper, her right hand at her left armpit, and puffed hard at a cigarette. With her dark hair falling over her brow, she looked like a gypsy. After tea, she drove off to buy a gramophone. Why a gramophone? On this of all days. Utterly exhausted with a splitting headache, Albinus lay on the sofa of a hideous drawing-room and thought, something unspeakably awful has happened, but I'm really quite calm. Elizabeth's swoon lasted 20 minutes, and then she screamed. Probably it was terrible to hear her, and I'm quite calm. She is still my wife, and I love her, and I shall of course shoot myself if she dies by my fault. I wonder how they explained to Irma the move to Paul's flat, and all the hurry and upset. It was disgusting the way Frida described it. And Madame screamed. Odd, because Elizabeth had never raised her voice before in her life. The next day, while Margot was out buying records, he wrote a long letter. In this he assured his wife quite sincerely, although maybe in too florid a style, that he treasured her as before, despite his little escapade, which has bruised our family happiness as the knife of a madman slashes a picture. He wept, listened to make sure that Margot was not coming back, and wrote on, sobbing and muttering to himself. He begged his wife's forgiveness, but his letter gave no indication as to whether he was prepared to give up his mistress. He received no answer. Then he realized that if he was not to go on tormenting himself, he must erase the image of his family from his memory and abandon himself utterly to the fierce, almost morbid passion which Margot's gay loveliness excited in him. She, on her part, was always ready to respond to his lovemaking. It only refreshed her. She was playful and without a care. The doctor had told her 2 years before that she could never have a child, and she regarded this as a boon and a blessing. Albinus taught her to bathe daily instead of only washing her hands and neck as she had done hitherto. Her nails were always clean now, and polished in brilliant red. On both fingers and toes he kept discovering new charms in her, touching little things which in any other girl would have seemed to him coarse and vulgar. The childish lines of her body, the shamelessness, and the gradual dimming of her eyes, as if they were being slowly extinguished like the lights in a theater, roused him to such a frenzy that he lost the last vestige of that diffidence which his prim and delicate wife had demanded of his embraces. He hardly ever left the house for fear of meeting acquaintances. It was with reluctance, and only in the mornings, that he let Margot go out of her adventurous hunts after stockings and silk underwear. He was amazed at her lack of curiosity. She never questioned him about his former life. Sometimes he tried to interest her in his past, telling her of his childhood, his mother, whom he remembered but vaguely, and his father, a full-blooded country squire who had loved well his dogs and horses, his oaks and his corn, and who had died quite suddenly of a fit of virile laughter in the billiard room where a guest was telling a bawdy story. What was the story? Tell it to me, Margot asked, but he had forgotten it. He told her about his early passion for painting, his works, his discoveries. He told her how a picture could be restored with the aid of garlic and crushed rosin, which converted the old varnish into dust, and how under a flannel rag, moistened with turpentine, the smokiness of the coarse picture painted over would varnish and the original beauty blossom out. Margot was chiefly interested in the market value of such a picture. He told her about the war, about the cold mud of the trenches, and she asked him why, being rich, he had not wrangled himself into a post behind the lines. What a funny darling you are, he would cry, fondling her. She began to get bored in the evenings. She longed for the cinema, smart restaurants, and Negroid music. You shall have everything, everything, he said. Only let me recover first. I have all sorts of plans. We'll go to the seaside soon. He looked around her drawing room and marveled how he, who prided himself on not being able to endure anything in bad taste, could tolerate this chamber of horrors. Everything, he mused, was beautified by his passion. We've really fixed ourselves up very nicely, haven't we, darling? She agreed condescendingly. She knew that all this was only temporary. The memory of his luxurious flat lingered in her mind, but of course there was no need for haste. One day in July, as Margot was returning from her dressmaker's on foot and was already nearing home, someone clutched her from behind above the elbow. She wheeled round. It was her brother Otto. He grinned unpleasantly. At a little distance, two of his friends were standing, and they grinned too. Glad to meet you, sis, he said. Not very nice of you to forget your folks. Let go, said Margot quietly, drooping her lashes. Otto stuck his arms akimbo. How fine you look, he said, examining her from head to foot. Really, quite the young lady. Margot turned round and walked away, but he gripped her arm again, hurting her, and she uttered a soft ow ow, as she had done when she was a child. Look here, said Otto, this is the third day I've been watching you. I know where you live, but we'd better move on a little farther. Let me go, whispered Margot, trying to loosen his fingers. A passerby stopped, anticipating a row. Her house was quite near. Albinus might happen to look out of the window. That would be a nuisance. She yielded to his pressure. He led her round the corner, leering and swinging her arms. The other two, Caspar and Kurt, followed. What is it you want? She asked, gazing with disgust at her brother's queasy cap and at the cigarette behind his ear. He motioned with his head to one side. Let's go into the bar there. No, she cried, but the other two came close up to her and snarled as they shoved her toward the door. She began to feel frightened. At the bar, a few men were discussing the coming elections in loud barking tones. Let's sit here in this corner, said Otto. They sat down. Margot remembered vividly with a kind of wonder how they all used to go out on suburban sprees, she, Otto, and these two sun-tanned youths. They taught her to swim and grabbed at her bare thighs under the water. Kurt had an anchor tattooed on his forearm and a dragon on his chest. They sprawled on the bank and pelted one another with clammy, velvety sand. They slapped her on the wet bathing pants as soon as she lay down flat. How jolly it all was, the merry crowd, litter of paper everywhere, a muscular, fair-haired Caspar on the edge of the lake, shaking his arms as though they were quaking and roaring, The water is wet, wet, when swimming. When he held his mouth under the water and trumpeted like a seal. And when he came out, the first thing he did was to comb back his hair and carefully put on his cap. She remembered how they played ball, and then she lay down and covered her with sand, leaving only her face bare, and made a cross of pebbles on top. See here, said Otto, and 4 gold-rimmed glasses of light beer appeared on the table. You've no need to be ashamed of your people because you've got a rich friend. On the contrary, you must think about us. He took a sip, and his friends did the same. They both watched Margot with contemptuous hostility. You don't know what you're talking about, she said disdainfully. It's quite different from what you think. As a matter of fact, we're engaged. All three burst out laughing. Margot was filled with such loathing that she looked away and fidgeted with the fastening of her handbag. Otto took it out of her hand, opened it, and found there was a powder box, keys, a tiny handkerchief, and 3.5 marks, which he took. That will be enough for the beer, he remarked, and then he made a little bow and laid the bag in front of her. They ordered more. Margot, too, swallowed, and with some effort. She hated beer, but she did not want them to have hers. Can I go now? She asked, patting the twin locks on her temples. What? Don't you like sitting with your brother and his friends? Asked Otto in mock astonishment. My dear, you've changed a lot. But we've not yet come to business. You've stolen my money, and now I'm going. Again they all snarled, and again she felt frightened. No question of stealing, said Otto nastily. This isn't your money, but money which you got hold of from someone who sweated it out of the working classes. So you'd better not talk about stealing, you. He checked himself and continued more calmly. Listen here, you. Get some cash from your friend for us, for the family. 50 will do, see? And suppose I don't, then we'll have our sweet revenge, answered Otto quietly. Oh, we know all about you. Engaged, that's a good one. Margot beamed sullenly and whispered with lowered eyelashes. All right, I'll get it. Is that all? Can I go now? Good girl, but what's the hurry? Besides, we ought to see a little more of one another. How about taking a trip to the lake one day, eh? He turned to his friends. What larks we used to have. She ought not to give herself such airs, ought she? But Margot had already risen to her feet and was emptying her glass, standing. Noon tomorrow at the same corner, said Otto, and then we'll drive out for the whole day. Agreed? Agreed, said Margot brightly. She shook hands all round and went out. She returned home, and when Albinus put down his paper and rose to meet her, she tottered and pretended to faint. It was an indifferent performance, but it worked. He was thoroughly frightened, made her comfortable on the couch, and brought her some water. What's the matter? Do tell me, he kept repeating as he stroked her hair. Now you'll leave me, groaned Margot. He gulped and immediately leapt to the worst conclusion. She had been unfaithful to him. Good, then I'll kill her, he thought swiftly. But aloud he repeated quite calmly, What's the matter, Margot? I have deceived you, she whimpered. She must die, thought Albinus. I've deceived you terribly, Albert. First of all, my father is not an artist. He used to be a locksmith, and now he's a porter. My mother polishes the banisters, and my brother's a common workman. I had a hard childhood. I was flogged, tortured. Albinus felt exquisite relief, and then a flood of pity. No, don't kiss me. You must know all. I escaped from home. I earned money as a model. A terrible old woman exploited me. Then I had a love affair. He was married like you, and his wife wouldn't divorce him, so I left him, as I could not bear to be his only mistress, although I loved him madly. Then I was pestered by an old banker. He offered his whole fortune to me, but of course I refused him. He died of a broken heart. Then I took that job at the Argus. Oh, my poor, hunted little bunny, murmured Albinus, who incidentally had long ceased to believe that he was her first lover. And you really don't despise me? She asked, smiling through her tears, which was difficult, seeing that there were no tears to smile through. I'm so glad you don't despise me, but now let me tell you the most terrible part. My brother has found where I live. I met him today, and he demands money, trying to blackmail me because he thinks you know nothing about my past. You see, when I saw him, and thought what a disgrace it was to have such a brother, and then when I thought my sweet, trusting Woggy had no idea what my family was like. I was so ashamed of them, and because I had not told you the truth, too. He took her up in his arms and rocked her to and fro. He would have crooned a lullaby had he known one. She began to laugh softly. What's to be done about it? He asked. I'll have to be afraid to let you go out alone now. Shall we tell the police? No, not that, exclaimed Margot with extraordinary emphasis. Next day, for the first time, Albinus accompanied her when she went out. She wanted many light frocks and bathing things and pounds of cream that would help the sun to bronze her. Sulfi, the Adriatic resort which Albinus had selected for their first trip together, was a hot and dazzling place. As they were getting into a cab, she noticed her brother standing on the other side of the street, but did not point him out to Albinus. Showing herself with Margot made him acutely uncomfortable. He could not get used to his new position. When they returned, Otto had vanished. Margot rightly supposed that he was very hurt and would now act injudiciously. 2 days before their departure, Albinus was seated at a peculiarly uncomfortable desk, writing a business letter while she was packing things into the new shiny black trunk, the adjoining room. He heard the rustling of a tissue paper and a little song which she used, softly humming to herself, her mouth shut. How strange it all is, thought he. Had I been told on New Year's Eve that my life would change so completely in a few months. Margot dropped something in the next room. The humming stopped for a moment and was then softly resumed. 6 months ago I was a model husband in a Margot-less world. Quick work of fate made of it. Other men can combine a happy family life with little infidelities, but in my case everything went crash immediately. Why? And here I sit and seem to be thinking clearly and sensibly, yet in the reality the earthquake is in full swing, and God knows how things will settle themselves. Suddenly the bell rang. From 3 different doors, Albinus, Margot, and the cook all ran out of the hall simultaneously. Albert, whispered Margot, be very careful, I'm sure it's him. Go to your room, he whispered back. I'll handle him nicely. He opened the door. It was the girl from the milliner's. Hardly had she gone than there was another ring. He opened again. Before him stood a youth whose coarse, oafish countenance, not resembling Margot's strikingly. Before him stood a youth with a coarse, oafish countenance, yet resembling Margot strikingly. Those dark eyes, that sleek hair, that straight nose slightly wedged at the tip. He wore a Sunday suit, and the end of his tie was tucked into his shirt between the buttons. What do you want? Asked Albinus. Otto coughed and said with a confidential huskiness in his voice, I must talk to you about my sister. I'm Margot's brother. And why to me particularly, may I ask? Are you began Otto in a questioning tone. Schiffermiller, said Albinus, rather relieved to learn that the boy did not know his identity. Well, Schiffermiller, I happened to see you with my sister, so I thought it would perhaps interest you if we, certainly, but why stand in the doorway? Please come inside. He came and coughed again. What I want to say is this, Schiffermiller. My sister is young and inexperienced. Mother hasn't slept a single night since our little Margot left home. She's only 16, you know. Don't believe her if she says she's older. Let me tell you, we're decent people. My father is an old soldier. It's a very, very unpleasant situation. I don't know what amends can be made. Otto, gaining confidence, was beginning almost to believe what he said. I really don't know, he continued with rising excitement. Just imagine, Schiffermiller, if you had a loved, innocent sister whom someone had bought. Now listen, my good fellow. Albinus interrupted him. There seems to be some mistake. My fiancé told me that her family was only too thankful to be rid of her. Oh, no, said Otto, winking. You've not You're not going to make me believe you'll marry her. When a man wants to marry a respectable girl, he talks to her family about it. A little more care and a little less pride, Herr Schiffer-Miller." Albinus gazed at Otto with curiosity as he reflected that the young brute was talking sense in a way, for he had as much right to concern himself over Margot's welfare as Paul had to worry on behalf of his sister. Indeed, there was a fine flavor of parody about this talk in comparison with that other dreadful conversation 2 months ago, and it was pleasant to think that now at least he could stand on his own ground, brother or no brother, take advantage, if it were, of the fact that Otto was simply a bluffer and a bully. "You better stop," he said very resolutely, very coolly, quite the patrician, in fact. "I know exactly how things stand. It is no concern of yours. Now please go." "Oh, really?" said Otto, frowning. "Very well." He was silent, twisted his cap in his hand, and looked at the floor. Then he tried a different key. "You may have to pay dearly for it before you're done, Herr Schiffer-Miller. My little sister is not exactly what you think her to be. I called her innocent, but that was brotherly compassion. You're too easily led by the nose, Herr Schiffer-Miller. It's mighty funny to hear you call her your fiancée. It makes me laugh. Now I could tell you a thing or two, quite superfluous," replied Albinus, flushing. "She has told me everything herself, an unfortunate child whom her family could not protect. Please go at once," and Albinus opened the door. "You'll regret it," said Otto, awkwardly. "Go, or I'll kick you out," said Albinus, putting the last sweet touch to victory, so to speak. Otto retired very slowly. Being endowed with that kind of shallow sentimentality peculiar to his bourgeois set, Albinus, with the plum in his mouth, suddenly pictured to himself how poor and ugly the life of this boy must be. Also, he did look like Margot, when Margot sulked. Before shutting the door, he swiftly produced a 10-mark note and pressed it into Otto's hand. The door closed. Otto, alone on the landing, examined the note, stood there a moment lost in thought, then rang the bell. "What, back again?" exclaimed Albinus. Otto stretched out his hand with the money. "I don't want your tips," he muttered angrily. "Better give it to the unemployed. There are plenty of them about." "But please take it," said Albinus, feeling terribly embarrassed. Otto shrugged his shoulders. "I don't accept crumbs from the bloody rich. A poor man has his pride. Well, it was only meant," began Albinus. Otto shuffled his feet, thrust the note sullenly into his pocket, and muttering walked on downstairs. Social honor was satisfied. Now he could afford to satisfy more human needs. "Not much," he reflected, "but better than nothing, anyway. And he's afraid of me, the pop-eyed, stammering fool." From the moment when Elizabeth had read Margot's short letter, her life had turned into one of those long, grotesque riddles that one is set to work out in the dream classroom of dull delirium, and at first she felt as if her husband were dead and people were trying to deceive her into thinking that he had only deserted her. She remembered now, on that evening which now seemed so remote, she had kissed him on the forehead before he went, and he had said, as he stopped, "Anyhow, you had better see Lampert. She can't go on scratching herself like that." These hadn't been his last words in this life, simple, homely words, referring to a slight rash which had broken out on Irma's neck, and that he had gone forever. The zinc ointment had cured the rash in a few days, but there was no ointment in the world which could mollify and erase the memory of the big white forehead and the way he had patted his pockets as he left the room. During the first day she wept so much that herself was surprised at the capacity of her lacrimal glands. Do scientists know how much salted water can flow from a person's eyes? And that reminded her of how one summer on the Italian coast they had used to bathe the baby in a tub of seawater. Oh, how one might fill a far bigger tub with her tears and wash a struggling giant. Somehow his abandonment of Irma seemed to her far more monstrous than his desertion of her. Or how would he be trying to steal his daughter? Was it prudent to have her sent to the country alone with the nurse? It was, said Paul, and he urged her to go there too. But she would not hear of it. Although she felt she could never forgive, not that he had humiliated her, she was much too proud to feel wronged that way, but because he had abased himself. Still, Elizabeth waited on, hoping from one day that the door would open like the night and thunderclap, and that her husband would come in pale as Lazarus, his blue eyes swollen and wet, his clothes worn to shreds, his arms wide open. The greater part of the day she sat in one of the rooms, or sometimes even in the hall, in any place where the heavy mists of her thoughts happened to overtake her, and pondered over this or that detail of her married life. It seemed to her he had always been unfaithful, and now she remembered and understood as one learning a new language might remember once seeing a book in that tongue when she did not yet know it. The red stains, sticky red kisses, which she had noticed once on her husband's pocket handkerchief. Paul did all he could to distract her thoughts. He never referred to Albinus. He changed some of his pet habits, that of spending Sunday morning at the Turkish baths, for instance. He brought her magazines and novels. They talked about their childhood, their parents long dead, and that fair-haired brother of theirs who had been killed in the Somme, a musician, a dreamer. One hot summer day when they had gone to the park, they watched a small monkey which had escaped from its owner and was up in a tall elm tree. Its little black face and a crown of gray fluff peered over the green leaves, then was gone, and a branch bristled and shook several feet higher. In vain did its master try to tempt it down by means of a soft whistle, a large yellow banana, a pocket mirror which he flashed and flashed. It won't come back, it's hopeless. It will never come back, she murmured, and burst into tears. 13. With nothing but deep blue above, Margot lay spread-eagled on the platinum sand, her limbs a rich honey brown, and a thin white rubber belt relieving the black of her bathing suit, the perfect seaside poster. Lying alongside of her, Albinus propped up his cheek and looked with endless delight at the oily gloss of her closed eyelids and at her freshly made-up mouth. Her wet dark hair was thrown back from her round forehead, and grains of sand glittered on her little ears. If you looked very close, there was an iridescent sheen in the pits of her brown-polished shoulders. The close-fitting seal-like black thing she had on was much too short to be true. Albinus let a handful of sand trickle, as from an hourglass, onto her indrawn stomach. She opened her eyes, blinked in the silver-blue blaze, smiled, and shut her eyes again. After a while she drew herself up, clasped her arms around her knees, and remained sitting motionless. Now I could see her back bared to the waist with the glitter sand grains along the curve of her spine. He brushed them away gently. Her skin was silky and hot. Heavens, said Margot, how blue the sea is today. It really was blue, a purple blue in the distance, peacock blue coming nearer, diamond blue where the wave caught the light. The foam toppled over, ran, slowed down, then receded, leaving a smooth mirror on the wet sand, which the next wave flooded again. A hairy man in orange-red pants stood at the edge of the water wiping his glasses. A small boy shrieked with glee as the foam gushed into the walled city he had built. Gay parasols and striped tents seemed to repeat in terms of color what the shouts of the bathers were to the ear. A large bright ball was flung from somewhere and bounced on the sand with a ringing thud. Margot grabbed it, jumped up, and swung it back. Now Albinus saw her figure framed in the gray pattern of the beach, a pattern he hardly saw, so entirely was his gaze concentrated on Margot. Slim, sunburned, with her dark head of hair and one arm with the gleam of the bracelet still outstretched after her throat, she seemed to him an exquisitely colored vignette, heading the first new chapter of his new life. She went up to him as he lay full length, a towel over his pink blistered shoulders, watching the movements of her little feet. She bent over him, and with a Berlinese chuckle, gave him a high, hard slap on his well-filled bathing pants. "The water is wet," she cried, and ran into the surf. There she advanced, swinging her hips and her outspread arms, pushing forward in knee-deep water, and then fell on all fours, tried to swim, gurgled, swam up, scrambled up, and went on, up to the waist and foam. He splashed in after her. She turned toward him, laughing, spitting, wiping the wet hair from her eyes. He attempted to duck her, then caught her by the ankle, and she kicked and screamed. An Englishwoman was lolling on a deck chair beneath a mauve sunshade reading Punch, turned to her husband, red-faced, white-hatted man, squatting on the sand, and said, "Look at that German romping about with his daughter. Now don't be so lazy, William. Take the children out for a good swim." 14. Afterward, in their gaudy bath gowns, they walked up and up a flinty path half smothered in broom and ilex. Yonder in a small villa, whose rent was enormous, gleamed white as sugar between the black cypresses. Great beautiful crickets skidded across the gravel. Margot tried to catch them. She crouched down and cautiously stretched out finger and thumb, but the cricket's sharp-elbowed limbs jerked suddenly. The fan-shaped blue wings shot out, and it flew 3 yards on to vanish as soon as it fell. In the cool room with the red-tiled floor, where the light through the slits of the shutters danced in one's eyes and lay in bright lines at one's feet, Margot, snake-like, shuffled off her black skin, and with nothing on but high-heeled slippers, clicked up and down the room, eating a sibilant peach. The stripes of sunshine crossed and recrossed her body. In the evenings, there was dancing at the casino. The sea looked paler than the flushed sky, and the lights of a passing steamer glowed festively. A clumsy mouth flapped round a rose-shaded lamp, and Albinus danced with Margot. Her smoothly brushed head barely reached his shoulder. Very soon after their arrival, they made several acquaintances. He was conscious of a gnawing, degrading jealousy when he saw how closely Margot pressed her partner as she danced, especially as he knew that she had nothing on beneath her flimsy frock. Her legs had browned so prettily that she wore no stockings. Sometimes Albinus lost sight of her. Then he got up and walked about restlessly, tapping a cigarette against his case. He would wander into a room where people were playing cards and onto a terrace, and then back again with the sickening conviction that she was deceiving him. Suddenly she would appear from nowhere and sit down by his side in their beautiful, shimmering dress and take a long draught of wine. He did not betray his fears, but nervously stroked beneath the table her bare knees, which knocked against one another as she leaned back on her chair and laughed, a little hysterically, he thought, at something not over funny that her last partner was saying. To Margot's credit, it must be admitted that she did try her utmost to remain quite faithful to him, but no matter how tender and thoughtful he was in his love-making, she knew all along that for her it would always be a love minus something, whereas the least touch of her first lover had always been a sample of everything. Unfortunately, a young Austrian, who was the best dancer in Solfi, and a crack ping-pong player to boot, somehow resembled the man Miller. There was something about his strong knuckles, his keen sardonic eyes, which kept reminding her of things she would have preferred to forget. One hot night between 2 dances, she happened to stray with him into a dark corner of the casino garden. The dull Swedish smell of a fig tree weighted the air, and there was that banal blend of moonlight and distant music which is apt to affect simple souls. "No, no," muttered Margot, and she felt his lips on her neck and cheek, while his clever hands groped their way up her legs. "You shouldn't," she whispered, and threw back her head and greedily returned his kiss. He caressed her so thoroughly that she felt the little strength she still had ebbing away, but in time she slipped free and ran into the brightly lit terrace. The scene was never repeated. Margot had so fallen in love with the life that Albinus could offer her, a life full of the glamour of a first-class film, with the rocking palm trees and shuddering roses, for it always was windy in filmland, and she was so afraid of seeing it all snap that she dared not take any risks. Indeed, she even lost for a time her ruling characteristic, self-confidence. She recovered it, however, as soon as they returned to Berlin in the autumn. "Very nice, to be sure," she said dryly as she surveyed the good hotel room where they had put up. "But I hope you understand, Albert, that we can't go on like this forever." Albinus, who was dressing for dinner, hastened to assure her that he was already taking steps to rent a new flat. "Does he really think me a fool?" she wondered with fierce resentment. "Albert," she said aloud, "I see you don't understand." She sighed deeply and covered her face with her hands. "You're ashamed of me," she said, watching him through her fingers. Gaily, he tried to embrace her. "Don't touch me," she screamed, giving him a smart shove with her elbow. "I know perfectly well you're afraid to be seen with me in the street. If you're ashamed of me, you can leave me and go back to your Lizzie. You're quite free." "Don't, darling," he pleaded helplessly. She flung herself on the sofa and managed to burst into sobs. Albinus pulled up the knees of his trousers, knelt down, and tried carefully to touch her shoulder, which jerked every time his fingers approached it. "What is it you want?" he asked softly. "What is it you want, Margot?" "I want to live with you quite openly," she blubbered, "in your own home, and to see people." "Very well," he said, rising to his feet and brushing his knees. "And in a year's time you'll marry me," thought Margot as she went on sobbing nicely. "You'll marry me unless by that time I'm already in Hollywood, in which case you may go to the devil." "If you don't stop crying," said Albinus, "I shall begin to cry myself." Margot sat up and smiled plaintively. Tears only added to her beauty. Her face was aflame, the iris of her eyes dazzling, and a large tear trembled on the side of her nose. He had never before seen tears of that size and brilliance. 15. Just as Albinus had accustomed himself never to speak to Margot of art, of which she knew and cared nothing, he had to now learn to hide from her the agonies he suffered during the first days of their life together in the old flat where he had spent 10 years with his wife. All around were objects which reminded him of Elizabeth, her presence to him and his to her. In Frida's eyes he read sullen censure, and before a week had passed, she left after listening contemptuously to Margot's second or third outburst of shrill scolding. The bedroom and the nursery seemed to gaze at Albinus with touching and innocent reproach, especially the bedroom, for Margot had promptly cleared everything out of the nursery and turned it into a ping-pong room. But the bedroom, the first night Albinus fancied he could detect the faint scent of his wife's eau de cologne, and the depressed and hampered him, so that Margot giggled over his unexpected reserve. The first telephone call was torture. An old friend rang up to ask if they had a good time in Italy, how Elizabeth was feeling, and whether she could go with his wife to a concert on Sunday morning. As a matter of fact, we are living apart for the present, Albinus said with an effort. For the present, thought Margot mockingly, as she twisted before the mirror to examine her back, which she had faded from brown to golden. The news of the change in his life very soon spread, though he fondly hoped nobody knew that his mistress lived with him. He took the usual precaution, and they began to have parties, which was to have Margot go off with other guests and come back 2 minutes later. He felt a dismal interest in noticing the way people gradually stopped inquiring after his wife, how some ceased to visit him, how a few, the staunch borrowers, were surprisingly friendly and hearty, how the bohemian crowd tried to look as if nothing had happened, and finally, there were some, fellow scholars mostly, who were ready to visit him as before, but never came with their wives, among whom there seemed to have spread a remarkable epidemic of headaches. He grew accustomed to Margot's presence in these rooms, once so full of memories. She had only to change the position of some trifling object, and immediately lost its soul, and the memory was extinguished. It was only a matter of how long she would take to touch everything, and as she had quick fingers, in a couple of months his past life in these 12 rooms was quite dead. Beautiful as the flat was, it no longer had anything in common with the flat in which he had lived with his wife. Late one night, as he was soaping Margot's back after a dance, she was amusing herself by standing in the full bath upon her enormous sponge, bubbles coming up as in a glass of champagne. She suddenly asked him whether he did not think she could become a film actress. He laughed and said thoughtlessly, his mind wholly absorbed in other pleasant things, "Of course, why not?" A few days later she returned to the subject, this time choosing a moment when Albinus's head was clear. He was delighted at her interest in the cinema and began to unfold a certain favorite theory in his regarding the comparative merits of the silent film and the talkie. "Sound," he said, "will kill the cinema straight away." "How did they make a film of you?" she interrupted. He suggested taking her to his studio where he could show her everything and explain the process. After that, things moved very rapidly. "Stop, what am I doing?" Albinus asked himself one morning, as he recalled that night before he had promised to finance a film which a mediocre producer wanted to make on condition that Margot was given the second feminine part, that of a forsaken sweetheart. "Silly of me," he thought. "The place will be full of slick young actors, dripping with sex appeal, and I shall make myself ridiculous if I accompany her everywhere. On the other hand," he consoled himself, "she needs some sort of occupation to keep her amused, and if she's going to get up early, we'll quit spending every blessed night at the dances." The contract was signed, and rehearsals began. For the first few days, Margot came home extremely cross and resentful. She complained that she was forced to repeat the same movement hundreds of times in succession, that the director shouted at her that she was blind by the lamps. She had only one consolation: the fairly well-known actress who was leading Lady Doriana Karenina, who was charming to her, praised her acting and prophesied that she would do wonders. A bad sign, thought Albinus. She insisted that he should not be present during work. It made her self-conscious, she said. Besides, if she had seen it all beforehand, the film would not be a surprise for him, and Margot liked people to have surprises. However, he derived a great deal of pleasure from catching glimpses of her assuming dramatic poses in front of the cheval glass. A creaking board gave him away. She hurled a red cushion at him, and he had to swear that he had seen nothing. He used to take her to the studio in a car and then fetch her home. One day he was told that the rehearsal would last some 2 hours, so he went for a walk and blundered into the neighborhood where Paul lived. All at once he felt a keen desire to meet his pale, plain little daughter. It was about the time she usually came back from school. As he turned the corner, he half fancied that he saw her in the distance with her nurse, but suddenly he felt frightened and walked quickly away. On this particular day, Margot came out to him and flushed, laughing. She had acted beautifully, and so soon the filming would be over. "I'll tell you what," said Albinus, "I'll invite Doriana to supper. We'll have a big supper and some interesting guests." Yesterday an artist rang me up, a cartoonist to be correct, a man who makes funny drawings and things, you know. He's just back from New York and is quite a genius in his way. I'll get him along too. Only I want to sit by you, said Margot. All right, but remember, my pet, I don't want them all to know that you live with me. Oh, they all know that, you fool, said Margot, her face suddenly darkening. But that places you and me in false position, Albinus pointed out. You must realize that. It doesn't matter to me, of course, but for your sake, please, do as you did last time. But it's so stupid, and besides, there's a way we could avoid all these unpleasantnesses. How avoid them? If you don't understand, she pouted. When will he begin to talk of the divorce, she thought. Do be reasonable, said Albinus coaxingly. I do everything you ask, you know quite well, pussy. But he had gradually got together a quite little menagerie of pet names. 16. Everything was as it should be. On the lacquer tray in the hall, cards had been shrewdly prepared with the names of the expected guests coupled so that people might know at once with whom they would go and to supper. Dr. Lambert with Sonia Hirsch, Axel Rex with Margot Peters, Boris von Ivanhoff, and Olga Waldenheim, and so on. An impressive footman, recently engaged with the face of an English lord, or at any rate so Margot thought, and her eyes used to linger on him not unkindly, showed the guests with dignity. Every few minutes the bell rang. In the drawing-room there were already 5 besides Margot. In came Ivanhoff, von Ivanhoff, as he deemed fit to have himself called, lean, ferrety, with bad teeth and an eyeglass. Then Baum, the author, a stout, red-faced, fussy individual with strong communistic leanings and a comfortable income, accompanied by his wife, an elderly woman, her figure still glorious, who in her troubled youth had swung about in a glass tank among performing seals. Conversation was already quite lively. Olga Waldheim, a white-armed, full-bosomed singer, with waved hair the color of orange marmalade, with gem of melody in every inflection of her voice, was telling, as she usually did, cute stories about her 6 Persian cats. Albinus, as he stood and laughed, gazed across old Lambert's white brush of hair, a fine throat specialist and indifferent violinist, at Margot, and thought how well her black tulle gown with the velvet dahlia at her breast suited her, the darling. There was a faintly defensive smile on her bright lips, as if she were not quite sure whether her leg was being pulled, and her eyes had that special fawn-like expression which meant he knew that she was listening to things she did not understand, in this case Lambert's ideas about the Hinsmith's music. Suddenly he noticed that she had blushed violently and risen to her feet. How foolish! Why did she get up? He thought, as several new guests entered, Doriana, Karenina, Axel Rex, and 2 minor poets. Doriana embraced and kissed Margot, whose eyes were shining brilliantly as if she had just been crying. How foolish, thought Albinus again, to grovel before that second-rate actress. Doriana was as famous for her exquisite shoulders, her Mona Lisa smile, and her husky grenadier voice. Albinus walked up to Rex, who did not quite know which was his host, and was rubbing his hands as though he were soaping them. Delighted to see you at last, said Albinus. Do you know I had formed quite a different picture of you in my mind, short, fat, with horn-rimmed glasses, though on the other hand your name has always reminded me of an axe. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man who makes 2 continents laugh. Let us hope he is back in Germany for good. Rex, his eyes twinkling, made little bows, rubbing his hands all the time. He spotted a striking lounge suit and a world of badly cut German dinner jackets. Please be seated, said Albinus. Haven't I met your sister once? Queried Doriana in her lovely bass voice. My sister is in heaven, answered Rex gravely. Oh, I'm sorry, said Doriana. Never was born, he added, and sat down on a chair next to Margot. Laughing pleasantly, Albinus let his eyes stray back to her. She was bending toward her neighbor, Sonia Hirsch, the plain-faced motherly cubist, in a queer childlike attitude, her shoulders a little hunched and talking unusually fast, with moist eyes and fluttering eyelids. He looked down at her small fleshed ear, the vein on her neck, the delicate shadow between her breasts. Hurriedly, feverishly, she was pouring out a stream of complete nonsense, with her hand pressed to her flaming cheek. Manservants steal far less, she jabbered, though of course no one would lift a really big picture, and at one time I adored big ones with men on horseback, but when one sees such a lot of pictures— Fraulein Peters, said Albinus in a soothing tone. This is the man who makes 2 continents. Margot started and swerved around. Oh, really? How do you do? Rex bowed, and turning to Albinus, remarked quietly, I happened to read on the boat your excellent biography of Sebastiano del Piombo. Pity, though, you didn't quote his sonnets. Oh, but they are very poor, answered Albinus. Exactly, said Rex. That's what is so charming. Margot jumped up, and with a swift, almost bounding step, dashed toward the last guest, a long-limbed, weathered female, who looked like a plucked eagle. Margot had taken elocution lessons with her. Sonia Hirsch shifted to Margot's place and turned to Rex. What do you think of Cummings' work? She asked. I mean his last series, The Gallows and the Factories, you know. Rotten, said Rex. The door of the dining room opened. The gentlemen looked round for their ladies. Rex stood aloof. His host, who already had Doriana on his arm, gazed about in search of Margot. He saw her right in front, squeezing among the couples who were streaming into the dining room. She is not at her best tonight, he thought anxiously, and handed over his lady to Rex. By the time the lobsters were being tackled, the talk of the head of the table were the following strings of names would be best arranged in a curve. Doriana, Rex, Margot, Albinus, Sonia, Hirsch, and Baum were seated, was in full swing, although rather incoherent. Margot had emptied her third wineglass at one gulp, and was now sitting very erect with bright eyes staring straight in front of her. Rex paid no attention either to her or to Doriana, whose name annoyed him, but was arguing across the table with Baum, the author, concerning the means of artistic expression. A writer, for instance, he remarked, talks about India, which I have never seen, and gushes about dancing girls, tiger hunts, fakirs, betel nuts, serpents, the glamour of the mysterious East. But what does it amount to? Nothing. Instead of visualizing India, I merely get a bad toothache from all these Eastern delights. Now there's the other way, as for instance, the fellow who writes, before turning in I put on my waist boots to dry, and in the morning I found that thick blue forest had grown on them. Fungi, madam, he exclaimed to Doriana, who had raised one eyebrow, and at once India becomes alive for me, the rest is shop. Those yogis do marvelous things, said Doriana. Apparently they can breathe in such a way that— But excuse me, my good sir, cried Baum excitedly, for he had just written a 500-page novel, the scene of which was laid in Ceylon, where he had spent a sun-helmeted fortnight. You must illuminate the picture thoroughly, so that every reader can understand. What matters is not the book one writes, but the problem it sets and solves. If I describe the tropics, I'm bound to approach my subject from its most important side, that is, the exploitation, the cruelty of the white colonist. When you think of the millions and millions— I don't, said Rex. Margot, who was staring in front of her, giggled suddenly, and this somehow had nothing to do with the conversation. Albinus, in the middle of discussing the latest art exhibition, with its motherly cubist, glanced sideways at its young mistress. Yes, she was drinking too much. Even as he looked, she took a sip out of his own glass. What a child, he thought, touching her knee under the table. Margot giggled again and flung a carnation across the table at old Lampert. I don't know, gentlemen. What do you think of Udo Conrad? Said Albinus, joining in the fray. It would seem to me that he is of the type of author with exquisite vision and a divine style which might please you, Herr Rex, and that if he isn't a great writer it is because— and here, Herr Baum, I am with you— he has a contempt for social problems, which in this age of social upheavals is disgraceful and, let me add, sinful. I knew him well in my student days as we were together at Heidelberg, and afterward we used to meet now and then. I consider his best book to be The Vanishing Trick, the first chapter of which, as a matter of fact, he read here, at this table. At a similar table, and after supper they lolled and smoked and drank liqueurs. Margot flitted from place to place, and one of the minor poets followed her like a shaggy dog. She suggested burning a hole in his palm with a cigarette and started doing so, and though perspiring freely, he kept smiling like the little hero he was. Rex, who at length had been impossibly offensive to Baum, in a corner of the library, now joined Albinus and began to describe to him certain aspects of Berlin as if it were a distant picturesque city. He did it so well that Albinus promised to look up at his company, that lane, that bridge, that queer-colored wall. I'm dreadfully sorry, he said, that we can't get to work together on my film idea. I'm quite sure you'd have achieved wonders, but to be quite frank, I cannot afford it just now, at any rate. At length the guests were caught in that wave which, beginning as a low murmur, swells until, in a whirl of foamy farewells, it has swept them out of the house. Albinus was left alone. The air was blue and heavy with cigar smoke. Somebody had spilled something on the Turkish table. It was all sticky. The solemn, though slightly unsteady footman, if he gets drunk again, I'll dismiss him, opened the window, and the black, clear, frosty night streamed in. Not a very successful party, somehow, thought Albinus, as he yawned himself out of his dinner jacket. "17. A certain man," said Rex, as he turned round the corner with Margot, "once lost a diamond cufflink on the wide blue sea, and 20 years later, on the exact day, a Friday apparently, he was eating a large fish, but there was no diamond inside. That's what I like about coincidence." Margot trotted along by his side with her sealskin coat wrapped tightly around her. Rex seized her by the elbow and forced her to come to a halt. "I never expected to run across you again. How did you get here? I couldn't believe my eyes." As the blind man said, "Look at me. I'm not sure that you've grown prettier, but I like you all the same." Margot suddenly gave a sob and turned away. He pulled her by the sleeve, but she turned away still farther. They revolved on one spot. "For heaven's sake, say something. Where would you rather go? To my place or yours? What's the matter with you?" She shook him off and walked quickly back to the corner. Rex followed her. "What on earth's the matter with you?" he repeated in perplexity. Margot hastened her steps. He caught her up again. "Come along with me, you goose," said Rex. "Look, I've got something here." He drew out his wallet. Margot promptly struck him a backhand blow in the face. "That ring on your forefinger is very sharp," he said calmly, and he continued to follow her, hurriedly fumbling in his wallet. Margot ran to the entrance of a house and unlocked the door. Rex tried to thrust something into her hand, but suddenly he raised his eyes. "Oh, that's the little game, is it?" he said, as he recognized the doorway from which they had just emerged. Margot pushed open the door without looking round. "Here, take it," he said roughly, and as she did not, he pushed it down inside her fur collar. The door would have banged had it not been of the reluctant, compressed air kind. He stood there, pulled at his lower lip, and presently moved away. Margot groped through the darkness up to the first landing and was about to go on, when suddenly she felt faint. She seated herself on a step and sobbed as she had never sobbed before, not even that time when he had left her. She felt something crinkly against her neck, and grasped it. It was a piece of rough paper. She pressed the light switch and saw that she was holding in her hand not money but a pencil drawing, the back view of a girl bare-shouldered, bare-legged, on a bed, with her face to the wall. Under it a date was written, first in pencil, then overwritten in ink, the day, month, and year when he had left her. That was why he had told her not to look round, because he was sketching her. Was it really only 2 years since that day? The light went out with a thud, and Margot leaned against the grating of the lift, crying afresh. She was crying because he had left her that time, because he had concealed his name and his reputation from her, because she might all this time have been happy with him if he had stayed, and because she would then have escaped the 2 Japanese, the old man, and Albinus. And then she cried too, because at supper Rex had touched her right knee and Albinus her left, as though paradise had been on her right hand and hell on her left. She wiped her nose on her sleeve, groped in the darkness, and pressed the switch again. The light calmed her a little. She examined the sketch once more, reflected that however much it meant to her, it would be dangerous to keep it, tore it into fragments and flung those through the grating of the wall and the lift. This reminded her of her early childhood. Then she pulled out her pocket mirror, powdered her face with a swift circular motion, straining her upper lip as she did so, closed the bag with a resolute click, and ran up the steps. "Why so late?" asked Albinus. He was already in his pajamas. She explained breathlessly that she had found it difficult to get rid of von Ivanov, who had kept insisting that she must let him drive her home. "How my beauty's eyes are sparkling," he murmured, "and how tired and hot she is. My beauty has been drinking." "Now leave me alone tonight," replied Margot softly. "Bunny, please," implored Albinus. "I've been waiting so." "Wait a bit longer. First I want to know something. Have you done anything about the divorce yet?" "The divorce?" he repeated, taken aback. "Sometimes I can't understand you, Albert. After all, we must put things on a proper footing, mustn't we? Or perhaps you mean to leave me after a while and go back to Lizzie?" "Leave you? Stop repeating my words, you idiot. No, you shan't come near me till you give me a sensible answer." "Very well," he said. "On Monday I'll speak to my lawyer." "Positively? You promise?" Axel Rex was glad to be back in his beautiful native land. He had been having troubles lately. Somehow the hinges of luck had got stuck, and he had abandoned it in the mud like a broken car. There had been, for instance, that row with his editor who had failed to appreciate his last joke. Not that it was ever intended for reproduction. There had been a row generally. A rich spinster who had been mixed up in it, and a fishy, though very amusing, thought Rex sadly, money transaction, and a rather one-sided conversation with a certain authorities on the subject of undesirable aliens. People had been unkind to him, he reflected, but he forgave them readily. Funnily, the way people admired his work, and the very next moment attempted once or twice fairly successfully to punch his face. Worst of all, however, was the question of his financial position. Fame, not quite on the world scale, which that mild fool had yesterday suggested it to be, but still fame, had brought in a good deal of money at one period. Now, when he was rather at a loose end and hazy about his cartoonist career in Berlin, where people were, as they would always been, at the mother-in-law stage of humor, he would have had that money still, or at least some of it, had it not been a gambler. Having cultivated a penchant for bluff since his tenderest age, no wonder his favorite card game was poker. He played it whenever he could get partners, and he played it with his dreams, with historical characters or some distant cousin of his, long dead, whom in real life he never remembered, or with people who in real life again would have flatly refused to be in the same room with him. In that dream he took up, stacked together, and lifted close to his eyes the 5 dealt to him, saw with pleasure the joker and cap and bells, and as he pressed out with cautious thumb on top corner and then another, he found by degrees that he had 5 jokers. Excellent, he thought to himself, without any surprise at their plurality, and quietly made his fist bet, which Henry VIII, by Holbein, who had only 4 queens, doubled. Then he awoke up, still with his poker face. The morning was so bleak and dark that he had to turn on his bedside light. The gulls on the window looked filthy. They could have given him a better room for his money, which he thought they might never see. Suddenly, with a sweet shock, he remembered that curious meeting yesterday. As a rule, Rex recalled his love affairs without any particular emotion. Margot is an exception. In the course of these last 2 years, he had often found himself thinking of her. He had often gazed with something very like melancholy at that